Welcome back. Today we'll be getting into the next era of the United States is the Roaring Twenties.
And to review, there are some things that we've already talked about with the Roaring Twenties. The first is Prohibition, which we see take place with the 18th Amendment in 1919. And Mr. Hovind, what does Prohibition mean?
Prohibition means the banning of the sale, consumption, or production of alcohol.
That is correct. And then we see it repealed with the 21st Amendment in 1933. We've also already learned about the passing of the 19th Amendment, which has to do with women's suffrage. What does that mean, suffrage?
Suffrage is the right of an individual to vote. So therefore, women's suffrage is the right for women to vote.
So as we talk about the Roaring Twenties, we're going to not only focus on the good things, the happy times, but there are also a lot of dark sides to the 20s as well that we will be exploring.
Remember, at this point in history, we're just coming out of World War I. So the Treaty of Versailles has been passed, but it was never approved by the United States of America.
All because we want to stay out of that League of Nations. We want to avoid foreign entanglements.
Also, America is beginning to slip into a small economic recession, or a slump, because the industry is no longer producing goods for the war, which is common after many world wars or world conflicts.
And you start to see Americans questioning the progressive policies of most of the 1900s. That idea of a bigger government. They're not sure that that's what they want. So what we'll see happen is the 1920s will be the decade that you will see all Republicans in the White House. So these Republican presidents all promised a similar thing, and that is less government. All right? The first Republican president of the 1920s will be Warren Harding, a senator from Ohio, and he will promise to America that they will return to normalcy. But he will die of a heart attack in 1923, which will make way for Silent Calvin Coolidge, to take office in 1923 to 1929. And Calvin Coolidge is from the state of Vermont, where he was a lawyer. But back to this idea of pledging a return to normalcy. What this means is a return to isolationism and a return to pro-business and laissez-faire policies. A quote from Harding in his inaugural address was, he promised less government in business and more business in government. So we're going to see them start to cut taxes and spending. Within 2 years of Harding taking office, you will see the unemployment go from 12% to 2%.
When President Harding was in office, he gave many of his cabinet seats to old friends and political allies, people who were members of what was known as the Ohio Gang. Keep in mind, President Harding came from Ohio. And some of these members had little to no experience with politics and used their positions to sell government jobs, pardons, and protection from prosecution. One example particularly was known as the Teapot Dome scandal, wherein which the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, leased out government oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming to private oil executives. In return, he received $300,000 in bribe money. He was later charged, convicted, and sent to prison.
And this will gain Harding's administration a reputation of being corrupt, much like Ulysses S. Grant administration. But Harding will stick by people like Albert Fall, which will gain him the reputation of being a man of limited talents from a small town. So couldn't really handle being in Washington, being in the presidency. So while the domestic policy of these presidents is focused on less government, lowering taxes, lowering restrictions on businesses, their foreign policy will be more of an isolationism foreign policy, but at the same time, they will show a willingness to work with other countries in order to avoid future wars. They'll do so at the Washington Naval Conference, in which they will agree to disarmament, which means reducing the size of the military. In this event, they're talking about reducing the size of the Navy, along with countries like Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And then also by taking part in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is when 62 nations agree to outlaw wars with each other. They rejected war as an instrument of national policy.
Another example of this changing foreign policy was the Dawes Plan. And in 1924, Charles Dawes, he sought to ease the economic problems of Europe. And by doing this, the United States made loans to Germany so that they could pay off war reparations to Britain and France. This would in turn allow Britain and France to pay off their war loans to the United States.
So who wins? The United States. Now let's look at how Americans at the time, not just the presidency, is looking at foreigners. All right, we see the immigration restrictions taking place. If you remember the Immigration Act of 1924, where we see quotas. Remember, they'll let more people in from places like Britain and less people in from places like Russia. And then also the Sacco and Vanzetti trial in 1923.
In this trial, 2 Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, were charged with murder. After several appeals, they were found guilty and they were executed. This leading to the belief that immigrants are evil and they are anarchists, or they are anti-government.
And then the Red Scare. Following World War I, Russia goes through a revolution in which they will now turn to communism, which is the direct opposite of what we have here in America known as capitalism. Instead of individuals owning businesses and property, in communism, the government owns all of those things.
And we're beginning to see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. However, at this point, the Ku Klux Klan is targeting Catholics, Jews, and immigrants, or anyone who appeared to be, in their definition, un-American. So at this time, the economy begins to change, and it's becoming more about the business of America is business. The economy has rebounded from a post-war recession due to pro-business policies. High tariffs allowed corporate mergers, trust, and cut taxes to the rich. Essentially, the whole idea of laissez-faire is coming back into popular business practice.
The stock market will start to soar. People will be trying to invest any way necessary, including borrowing money to then invest in the stock market, which is called buying on margin. And this will be known as the Coolidge prosperity and will lead to a general economic boom. But not everyone experienced what was known as the Coolidge prosperity.
Workers were not looked after by the government anymore at this time. The government, again, it's embracing that idea of helping big business, or laissez-faire.
Farmers were also experiencing problems with overproduction due to the fact they had new machinery that increased crop production. Then they will see deflation and loss of income.
Native Americans were experiencing high unemployment rates and had the shortest lifespans, and reservations had no heat and running water.
African Americans, many of which who had went to the cities in the north during World War I and in the 1920s as well, to find that higher standard of living and to find jobs, were now experiencing higher unemployment now that there were more white workers back after the war.
At this time, there was the process beginning that was known as mass consumption, where huge amounts of goods were being bought by individuals because there were so many available. Advertisements were convincing people that their happiness depended on owning these goods and these products.
And many of these goods are powered by electricity. You know, you see things like the vacuum cleaner, the radio, which will revolutionize how Americans get their news and communication. You see the automobile sales really start to take off as mass production is making them more affordable for the average Americans. But many Americans are buying these goods using credit, doing a process known as installment buying, so paying a little bit each month for that product, and thus accumulating debt.
And at this time, there is more leisure activities coming about because of all these new inventions and the new products that people are buying.
That's right. With things like the vacuum cleaner, you spend less time on chores, and the washing machine, and all these things, people have more time to get out and do things. Movies, sports, all of these activities will flourish. Baseball really becomes hugely popular in the 20s.
And with this changing culture, people begin to follow celebrities or famous individuals such as Charlie Chaplin, Babe Ruth, and Charles Lindbergh.
During the 1920s, as culture is flourishing, you will see what is known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is led by African American writers, artists, and musicians who gathered in Harlem, New York during the 1920s. You'll see poets such as Langston Hughes be a big part of this movement. And then at the same time, in music, you have the Jazz Age taking place, a name that was coined by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It came to represent African American music of the time. You'll see the Charleston dance become very popular with this style of music. Artists like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong.
At this time, we're seeing a number of cultural clashes, which could be attributed to the changes in music, the changes in lifestyle, and many other factors. But it was most noticeable during the Scopes trial in 1925. Biology teacher John Scopes was arrested for teaching evolution in his classroom rather than creationism. Prosecutor William Jennings Bryan, who was a former
Presidential candidate.
3 times, was prosecuting against him. Scopes was found guilty, and he was fined $100.
But this reflects the overall social tension of the 20s between the old-fashioned way of life and the more modern way of life.
The Roaring Twenties brought about good and bad things to the American public, the American way of life. Politics brought a return to isolationism, staying out of foreign affairs, and laissez-faire policies, giving more favor to big business.
There were great social and economic changes in the 20s due to new age of consumerism and the automobile.
The nation is now united through transportation and communication technology.
But at the same time, there's a clash of values between the modernists and traditionalists, which caused uneasiness and conflict.
And it is important to remember that not all Americans shared in these good times.
And next time, we'll see even more Americans experiencing hard times as we look at the causes of the Great Depression.